Good afternoon, and welcome to our presentation this afternoon, English Language Learners in an MTSS Framework, Guidance for School Psychologists and School Counselors. We're presenting this afternoon from the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Office in Harrisburg. My name's Amy Smith, and I'm an educational consultant at the Patent Office in Malvern and past president of the National Association of School Psychologists. Our presentation today is the first in a series of 3. All the topics are related to working with students that are English learners. Our presentation today will look at federal and state policies, procedures, and resources regarding the education of language learners. The second presentation will be titled School Psychologists and School Counselors, What They Need to Know About Progress Monitoring and Language Instruction Educational Program Effectiveness. And finally, the third presentation will address culturally responsive practices and its impact on the linguistic, academic, social, and emotional development of English learners. Our second and third webinars will take place on the next 2 Thursday afternoons, October 4th from 2 to 3:30 in the afternoon, and October 11th from 2 to 3:30 in the afternoon. All 3 of these presentations are being recorded, and the recording with the accompanying training materials will be available on the Patent website, www.pattan.net. It'll be available in the near future. So if you or one of your colleagues can't attend during the scheduled time, or if you would like to review or share these presentations, you'll be able to do that at your convenience. Providing services to students with cultural and language differences presents specific challenges to school psychologists and school counselors. It's a constantly evolving field, and we're pleased to offer continuing professional development in this area. Throughout our presentation today, you'll be able to ask questions or ask for clarification by simply using the chat box feature on your screen. We will do our best to address questions as they come in. If you have questions following the presentation, on the last slide of your PowerPoint handout, we provide an email address for you to use and send in your questions. They will be forwarded to the presenters and answered as we receive them. So let me introduce the team that has developed and will be presenting this afternoon. All 3 of these women function as consultants to the Patent Office and work throughout the state on this very important topic. We have Ana Sanz de la Peña, Francine Dutrasek, and Paula Zucker. So without further ado, let's get started with our presentation.
Good afternoon. My name is Francine Dutrasek. Welcome to our Patent 3-part webinar. Let me try and okay. I am trying to advance the PowerPoint. Let's see here. It's not, nope. Okay, there we go. Patent's mission is probably a reminder. The mission of the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network, Patent, is to support the efforts and initiatives of the Bureau of Special Education and to build the capacity of local educational agencies to serve students who receive special education services. PD's commitment to a least restrictive environment is as follows. Our goal for each child is to ensure individualized education program Teams begin with the general education setting with the use of supplementary aids and services before considering a more restrictive environment. Before we get started, we'll have a few housekeeping details. In order to be awarded Act 48 credits, you must attend all 3 webinars. If perchance you're participating as a group at one computer, please contact Marcy Davis so that she can account for all 3 of you, for example. In order to receive Act 48, you must connect to the webinar online. It cannot be you may not connect on your phone, for example. So in order to receive Act 48, you must connect to the webinar online and complete the Survey Monkey provided at the end of this webinar. Using only your phone to access the webinar will not be accepted. To receive Act 48, you must attend all 3 webinars in order to be awarded those credits and complete a Survey Monkey for each date. A code to enter the Survey Monkey will be provided at the end of each webinar. To kind of couch our session today, we wanted to address this important piece that Amy addressed or alluded to in her introduction. Students who are culturally and linguistically diverse present unique challenges when referred for special education evaluation. If I had a magic wand that could help all school psychologists in determining the difference between a language barrier and a learning disability, I would make a whole group of people very happy. Language development is in a primary language, while learning a second language has specific implications for both instruction and assessment. To differentiate between a learning disability and a language barrier is not impossible, but is complicated. And hopefully within the 3 sessions, we will provide you with tools and strategies to support your work. Often, the academic delays specific to the process of second language acquisition and acculturation are often misinterpreted as learning disabilities. And the bottom line is that in Pennsylvania, there is still a disproportionate number of English learners in receiving special education services. We are doing a better job than we used to do. All 3 of us have been in this field for a long time. We are getting better at identifying English learners for special education services that belong in that group of students, but we are still, there are still disproportionately represented. Today's outcomes. Participants will identify current federal and state legal framework regarding the education of English learners. Participants will provide resources that target the legal implications of an effective language instruction educational program. Before we get started, we would like to get a sense of who you are. If you would be so kind to type in the chat box what role you play in your school system. Counselors, type 1, school psychologists, type 2, and if you hold a different position, type 3 and include your title. This would be very helpful for us to get a sense of what you do and in your districts and your charter schools. What are culturally responsive educational systems? Well, they are The bigger circle, there are systems that focus on people, practices, and policies within a bigger circle of culture and equity. Culturally responsive educational systems are responsive to cultural differences and seek to include rather than exclude differences. These systems are concerned with instilling caring ethics in the professionals that serve diverse students, support the use of curricula with ethnic and cultural diversity content, encourage the use of communication strategies that build on students' cultures, and nurture the creation of school cultures that are concerned with deliberate and participatory educational practices. Moreover, culturally responsive educational systems create spaces for teacher reflection, inquiry, and mutual support around issues of cultural differences. The bottom line, culturally responsive systems are concerned with instilling, are grounded in the belief that we need to build systems that are responsive to cultural differences. Students who come from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds are able to excel in academic endeavors if their culture, language, heritage, and experiences are valued and used to facilitate their learning and development. In another part of my life, I work for an intermediate unit, and often I am asked to visit schools and observe children who schools are concerned about the progress of the youngster. They're usually English learners, and they are struggling with academic achievement. And most times what I am seeing is that teachers and professionals are seeing English learners as half empty rather than half full. So with that lens, they are always seen from a deficit perspective rather than having assets that they can bring to learning. Again, in trying to provide some kind of framework to this presentation, we wanted to share with you these three images. In the first image, equality is provided because everybody's having the same benefit from the same supports. Everybody has the same size of box, even though one of those youngsters is only seeing a wooded panel. In the second picture, there's some differentiation provided, reducing the barriers. The tall student is in no need of a box. The second one needs only one, while the little one needs two. But there are still impediments for these children. The barrier is still there. In the third picture, all three children can see the baseball game, without any supports or accommodations because the cause of the inequality was addressed. Systemic barrier has been removed. In this next section of this webinar, we're going to address the federal and state policies regarding the education of English learners. With Every Student Succeeds Act, there were a lot of changes that were implemented that focused on English learners. We're going to try and keep those foci directed to what's in it for school psychologists and guidance counselors. Before we move forward, I don't know how many who's in the chat. Move forward. Okay. It was our attempt to get audience participation, but it did not work well. We'll try again at some other time. Okay. So the first thing we wanted to address with you are terms that some of them are ESSA terms, some of them were guidance provided from the state that created those changes, but you will be hearing those acronyms. I've always felt that in my field, we have an alphabet soup of acronyms, and this is supposed to kind of give you more support in here if you're hearing those terms, that you have some awareness of what they mean. So the first one is the Language Instruction Educational Program. This is a NESA term. It is encompassing the whole program, the whole school day for English learners. So from the time they come to school to the time they leave on that school day, and they are English learners, their program is called Language Instruction Educational Program. We were all concerned when it's abbreviated LIEP because of the danger of connecting it to IEP, and they have the same letters, but there is no affinity between those two. English language development is now ESL. ESL is no longer the discipline. It's now called English language development. Teachers are still in Pennsylvania called ESL teachers because we have an ESL program specialist certificate. But we all foresee that in the near future it may be called ELD program specialist. But at this point, they are ESL teachers. With ESSA, there were new requirements. One, in the identification of English learners and in the reclassification of English learners. Reclassification is the new term to mean exit. So when you see reclassification, it means that English learners no longer have that status. They are now exited, and that's why they're quote unquote reclassified. The WIDA screener came at that time. It used to be called the WAPT. Now the WAPT is only for kindergarten. The WIDA screener is for students from 1st grade to 12th grade. You probably heard me say English learners is now the term and not English language learners. I don't know how many of you just got used to calling them English learners and not ESL students. But it's now, federal government dropped language as part of their, the way we identify those students by that name. Dual language learners under ESSA is focusing on early childhood. So those dual language learners are children in preschool from 3-year-olds to 8, they're considered early childhood, but they tend to be focusing more on preschool, so 3 to 5. At the same time as ESSA, our state has provided a pathway for parents to refuse specialized ELD, ESL instruction. I'm just going to drop this here and say that we will address it a little bit more in depth farther in our presentation here. There are English language development standards for English learners. They were finalized last summer, 2017. Because of ESSA, the state had to change some reporting systems. Yes, their PIMS data is still uploaded in October concerning English learners, but the LEP system was replaced by the English Learner Reporting System, or ELLERS. You might hear people refer to that reporting system that way. Under ESSA, there will be more attention given to students that come to us from places in the world where they had limited or interrupted formal education because of war, because of lack of opportunity for whatever reason. There are criteria to identifying those students, and those criteria will be part of the identification process, which should mean that the program provided for them will be more supported and scaffolded. They need acceleration to their program because of the gap in their education. Finally, there's a greater lens on long-term English learners, and the abbreviation, no one says LTELS. I haven't heard it yet, but it's LTELS, but I'm thinking people are going to say LTELS. But it sounds kind of, anyway, to me it sounds unusual. Because of being a school psychologist, I just want to talk a little bit about data, because that data might be useful to you in your decision making, in evaluating English learners. Under ESSA, Title III still requires reporting of EL data. There are more indicators that are specific to English learners. The N has gone down from 40 to 20 per school. And that is a big change. It's half of what it used to be. ESSA still requires reporting on measures of progress toward English language proficiency, but now the data has to be disaggregated for ELs with disabilities. They want to see how our ELs with special needs are growing in our programs. ELs that exited their EL status are now monitored for 4 years and not 2, like what used to be under No Child Left Behind. Data on ELs with disabilities who have exited their EL status must also be reported. New data reporting required under ESSA. English learners that were initially classified as a level 1 entering will have 5 years to exit ESL. The bottom line is that ESSA is trying to put safeguards to prevent English learners from becoming long-term English learners. Long-term English learners have a greater dropout rate, greater behavior issues, all the things that we don't want our English learners to be living long-term. It's also, by the way, an EL indicator on the Future Ready PA Index. There are 3 required Title III activities now under ESSA. The first 2 have always been there. There needs to be annual professional development activities regarding English learners, direct services to students to improve both their English language development, their academic achievement. But the third one is now a requirement. Before it was a recommended activity, but now it's a requirement. Title III allocations must be expended to provide and implement parent, family, and community engagement activities. Parents now have the right to refuse separate ESL, ELD instruction. And what that is for school psychologists, this is an important piece, because even though parents refuse service, even when parents refuse services, the students will continue to be considered English learners. Their data has to be reported on PIMS. They need to be tested on the state-mandated Access for ELs language proficiency assessment. And classroom teachers need to provide, are responsible for the English language development for these students. So these students have to be monitored for adequate language development, and if the student's academic achievement is not meeting the required benchmark, benchmarks. The school must inform parents and provide them with the opportunity to reassess their decision. It's not a once and done decision once a year. It can be reinstated in the ELD. They're still part of the LIEP, but receiving ESL services, direct services, anytime during the school year. So, we have to be on the lookout for these kids that are not receiving ESL services at report card time or progress monitoring time, and ensure that we are aware that they are at any point, if they are moving towards failure, that we readdress that situation. A parental reinstatement request form is available at the bottom of this slide. These students I've already shared, these students have, even though they're not receiving ESL services, direct instruction, they are still being assessed annually with the state mandated Access for ELS assessment. Even though there was, under No Child Left Behind, there were no state level requirements to establish and implement entrance and exit procedures for EL programs, Pennsylvania already had that in place. So this is now a requirement under ESSA, but it's been a state policy for many years. The bottom line with ESSA is that ESSA is working towards educational equity for all students. And it is focused especially on students who are low income, of color, English learners, Native Americans, immigrants, or who have a disability. So what does that look like? We've talked about ESSA. What does that look like in Pennsylvania? Well, Pennsylvania reworked their webpage. And so everything that deals with English learners are now located in one location at Educating English Learners. In the PowerPoint that we have shared with you, all those topics, if you click on any of those, they are all hyperlinked to the documents. For the sake of time, I will not go through all of these, but in the next few slides, we will discuss some of the highlights that would have some impact on your roles. The Basic Education Circular is entitled Educating English Learners. It provides a whole lot of hyperlinks to documents and information that would be needed for your LEA's English Language Development Program. The bottom line for English learners is that your program has to be an effective program. The program is what will determine if an English learner is going to be successful in your school. So there is, in the BEC, in the previous BEC, there was an amount of time recommended to be spent in ELD instruction, and that piece was eliminated. What the state is really saying is we need to meet the three-pronged test of Castaneda versus Picard. Do we have a program that is based on sound educational theory? Is what we're doing working? Is it aligned to what we know about second language acquisition? Do we have, the second prong is, do we have the resources? Do we provide as much, do we have as much allocated for English learners as we do for the ELA? Do we have teachers of quality, teachers that are certified, that have some understanding of English learners, have been trained in growing English learners, And finally, if the program is not effective, let's look at how we can change it to make it better. We have to monitor the program. Is it growing our English learners like it should? The other piece that's really important that is now highlighted in the back is that the education of ELS is the responsibility of all teachers, not just the ESL teacher. English learners, the bottom line is that they need to feel like they belong, that the teachers value them, that they are perceived as capable human beings. And at the center of teaching and learning is a relationship. So if the teacher is not seeing that student as one of hers or of his, that child will perceive that, and it will have negative impact on that student. The BEC also provides guidelines for grading ELs. ELs need to be graded. EL need to be graded just like ALL students, all students, no difference. So the only time they can be graded differently is that when it's EL specific courses. EL information must not appear on high school transcripts. For those of you who are guidance counselors, we can't have sheltered social studies as part of the transcript. It would have to say social studies, period. I don't want to get too lost in details here. You can always explore it for yourself. We did want to let you know that sometimes you will hear administrators or people in districts ask, where do I find the law or the guidance telling me that I need to provide information in the preferred mode of communication of families? And this would be the tool that you could access. It's actually available in a multitude of languages, if you would like to share that with your families. The identification procedure for English learners from grades K-12 has morphed into a very elaborate process that's 9 pages long. I will just tell you that it involves the home language survey, it involves a family interview, it involves academic records review first before we even screen the student to see if he or she qualifies for services, for ESL instruction. There's also a section to identify students with SLIFE. Those are students with limited or interrupted formal education. It also has embedded in that document the parent notification and right to refuse, and also includes a procedure flowchart. By the way, the identification procedure, if you have a pre-K population, it would be a separate identification procedure. For school psychologists, okay, I'm missing a page here. No, I'm going, okay. Why is this chart important for school psychologists? Many of our emergent bilinguals, those are kids that have come to us with one language and are trying to learn English, will not qualify for ELD services in kindergarten, but begin to struggle in first grade when literacy demands become more difficult. It's really important to keep monitoring first graders that were placed on the primary or home language other than English list in kindergarten. And screening for ELD can occur at any time. First and second graders that did not qualify when screened in kindergarten may struggle with the language demands in first and second grade. what happens too is that teachers do not have an understanding of social language versus academic language, and many times will not perceive the first grader or the second grader who speaks English, quote unquote, perfectly, to have reading and writing issues that may stem from language development, a lack of proficiency. ELs that have who have or are suspected of having a disability have now a procedure, and it includes specific instruction. I will give you a few seconds to kind of scan this document rather than me having you read it to you, and then we will move on. All right. I probably did not give you enough time, but the purpose of this is hopefully to whet your appetite so that you can dig deeper and get a greater understanding. I did mention SLIFE students, and I will just say that there is a criteria. They have to be meet all four of these bullets. Foreign exchange students are also can be identified or counted as ELs. So English learners, foreign exchange students prior to 2 years ago were not considered at all or assessed for placement in English language instructional programs. But now it is a requirement. We did talk about parent right to refuse ESL, ELD instruction. As a reminder, it's only the ESL in direct instruction. It's not the whole program. When parents or families refuse services for their children, these English learners are not receiving ELD, ESL instruction, but content classroom teachers must provide instructional strategies to overcome language barriers in order to ensure equal access for ELs in the classroom. These English learners' families can also opt out of Title III supplemental services. Usually these activities are after-school, summer school programs. To address reclassification criteria and to complete this webinar, I will give the mic to Ana Saint de la Peña.
Thank you, Francine. I know that at this time of the afternoon and in a webinar, sometimes we need to sort of like change the voice of the presenter and just try to get into the mood of, okay, I have enough energy to continue. And we are actually moving ahead quite well. Great, Francine, congratulations. You actually met the goal of finishing at this time. I will continue with one very important aspect that is not only important for ELs, their families, and ESL teachers, and all the teachers, but for psychologists and counselors. This section here of reclassification criteria is crucial for you to understand that when somebody refers a student who has exited already the program, the ESL, the ELD program, you have to know what elements have been considered for this exit criteria. So the very first part, actually, the little section that you have there that says access, proficiency, and level scores, that is the language proficiency of the student. So access is the assessment that we use to measure English language proficiency in listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So the scores that you see there are in a scale of, from 1 to 5. And what you see, the scores that are on the left-hand side are actually the scores that they got in the last axis for ELs, and there are some assigned points to each section of the scores. So it's not only the English language proficiency that has been considered, but you see on the next rectangle that is, that has language use inventories, that section addresses what teachers are reporting through a rubric that is part of this document. So you have rubric 1 that is going to look at interaction, listening, speaking, and reading. And that rubric needs to be completed by the ESL teacher and a content teacher. So now we are incorporating not just the ESL teacher making the judgment about the student can actually, exit the program, but it is also the content teacher that is giving feedback about those aspects of the rubric. Then there is a second rubric that emphasizes writing skills. Why writing skills? Because as you know, writing skills really for a second language learner is the skill that it comes after a lot of work with language. And the same way, like with native speakers, that sometimes the way that you look at a student achievement and the way that you look at how they put together ideas and show not only verbal eloquence, but written discourse, the same way for a second language learner, that writing component is a way for us to measure how well they are going to actually perform once they are out in the mainstream without the ESL supports. So the writing rubric goes deeper into cohesion, word phrase, grammar, and genre, and then there's like different kinds of writing that we need to be collecting over time, so we can actually show that the student is achieving those levels in writing that are comparable to a native speaker and will be able to be successful in the mainstream. So get familiar with the reclassification criteria, because sometimes children who exit the program and are monitored for those 4 years now that are required, in some instances, teachers sometimes look at their grades and start referring these children for evaluation because their grades are going down, or they will need some specific interventions, but not going back again to the ESL program. Not really saying, okay, this is because of language, but sometimes it's not language, it is actually not having the behaviors or not having the required supports once they exit the program. Okay, so get familiar with the reclassification criteria. You can actually download, it's a document that has 5 or 6 pages, and you can download the whole document. So as a psychologist or a counselor, you're actually very familiar with the process, and you can ask the right questions when you talk about reclassification of ELs. Another part of the same document of the reclassification criteria is that finally, I am saying finally, because after so many years of looking at students with IEPs who had no access, they didn't have access to a door to exit the program. They stayed in the program, forever, because there was not a pathway to exit these students. So finally, we have been giving some guidance in how can you exit students who, because of their disability, they actually cannot perform at high levels in the access reading and writing, for example. So there is a pathway to exit these students. You have to become very familiar, because actually you are part also of providing feedback in relation to, the student that has an IEP and how their performance really is attached to their disability. So therefore, the language barrier is not an impediment for this student, there are other impediments that are not going to help them really perform in that access for ELs at the level of a student that does not have that disability. Okay, so there is a pathway. Get familiar with that. I think that PDE eventually is going to be providing more information about this. There's also, I don't know if you're aware, but if you have students with severe disabilities who take the PASA, they also have to take the alternate access for ELs. That has always been a topic of discussion because in the past we didn't have any parameters to measure how could we actually exit students that take PASA. And so now we have a pathway. So they tell you how you can do that. And this is very good for districts who historically have had, many students getting, entering the special education service area, and then there was no exit for these students. Therefore, when you look at the numbers, you could actually see that there were many, many ELs, but most of them in their IEPs, the ESL teacher and the other professionals around the table decided that they were not benefiting from the ESL instruction, but they were still kept and they would have to take access for ELs. In this case, now we have a pathway to exit the students. If you want to go deeper into how do we score, how WIDA scores ELs with the listening, speaking, reading, and writing access, you can always enter the WIDA webpage and look at the area of assessments. WIDA is very good at publishing, guidance or manuals in which you can actually see or go deeper into the scores that they provide, students with explanations about, raw scores. Also, we have the scale scores, and which are really very good way to chart growth. Usually, when we look at scores that are not related to scale scores, it's very hard to really chart growth. And WIDA has been very good at providing us with those tools. So whenever there is a discussion about a student, whether he hasn't been doing, any progress in maybe literacy, you always have to ask about, so how is he doing with English language development? And this is a place where you can find more information about how WIDA looks at the scores and comes up with suggestions in how to measure that growth. Another issue that is important for counselors and for psychologists is translated forms and documents. As you know, ESSA has been very clear about a requirement to engage families of culturally linguistically diverse students. And with that said, we also need to understand that Pennsylvania really has many different languages represented among our population of ELs. In some other states, it's a little easier because you just have Spanish represented and a few of other languages. Since Pennsylvania is also a center for refugees or a welcome center for refugees state, we have experienced in the past 15 years, an influx of students who come from, Myanmar and different other areas in Asia. So we have these students who are refugees and speak languages that maybe, we have never heard before. So in order to support our districts, Title III is paying for this Transact system that we have. And anybody, who is in Pennsylvania working in education can have access to these forms that have been translated in at least 10 of the most commonly spoken languages that we have in Pennsylvania. So you can log in that link, and you just follow the directions. There are many parent notifications. There's a lot of other forms that you can have access. And sometimes, you know, if you are a counselor or a psychologist, you maybe never heard about Transact, but this is important information for you to share also with other teachers. Some of the documents that you may find here are listed there. And if you, I think they're live links, right? That the ones that we have there. If you received our PowerPoint, and you can actually go and click in these areas, and you will go to that site. And this is important because Pennsylvania as a state recognizes the need to have some place where you can all go and try to find ways to really connect with your families. So do we have all of the forms required? Probably not, but this is a way to start. The other thing that I always recommend in you know, different school districts is to contact your migrant education program. Sometimes they provide you know, even translators, or they provide people who are from different communities, different culturally and linguistic communities who really are represented in the migrant education programs. And sometimes they could actually provide us with that linguistic support, or they can actually work with us as cultural brokers. That means, you know, make us aware of the needs of those communities. So that is another resource that we can share with you. Something that is on all educators, you know, sort of like in the back of our ideas as we start a new school year, is the Future Ready Pennsylvania Index indicators. And because ESSA really is focusing on very specific populations of children who have been historically underserved in education, we have to understand, all of us, psychologists, counselors, ESL teachers, principals, all teachers need to know that this is the new way that we are our schools will be measured in relation to outcomes for our students. One part that is very important is about the percent of proficient and advanced in English language arts, literature, and in mathematics, and Algebra 1, the PSSA, and all of that. So when we talk about proficiency, PDE will apply a count adjustment to scores on achievement assessments for currently identified ELs based on language proficiency. So that's important, because if it's based on language proficiency, in other words, the lower the student's English language proficiency, the less weight it will have in accountability measures. So that is something that we have never had before. So there is a weight for the higher the level of English language proficiency, the more responsible the student will be to perform, you know, the same as what is required. The less level, and that's why we have to be very familiar with those levels, right? Level 1 through 5. So the lower the level, the more weight they, the less weight, excuse me, they will have. Okay, and again, the newly arrived English learners will continue to be exempt from the ELA state-mandated assessment for 1 year. Every year we get some guidance from PDE about, so since when we can consider students participating. Academic progress. We are all now very familiar with the Pennsylvania Value-Added Assessment Systems, PVAS, which we have been looking at, you know, for different ways to improve the education of all children in Pennsylvania. These measures really are very important. And since I have gotten familiar with PVAS many years ago, there has always been that disaggregated section for English learners. So please be aware that that is going to be also part of this future index. indicator. Graduation rate for our ELs is not at the level where we want that to be, okay? So now we have a way to measure this. So it says children should be graduating in 4 or 5 or fewer years. But the number, again, and I think that we heard Francine saying that the minimum N is 20 now, okay? For English learners, language proficiency, which is another measure that we have always considered, to make decisions. And that is looking at this measure of how our ELs are growing, looking at our scale scores towards attaining English proficiency in listening, speaking, reading, and writing, measured by Access for ELLs. So that is important because we expect, at least ESSA and the Pennsylvania Department of Education is giving us a certain time to actually reclassify our students, and that is 5 years. And for all of us who have been involved in ESL instruction, we are very happy to see that there is a time frame for our students to attain English language proficiency. And why is that important? Because if you go to districts, mostly urban districts, what we see is that there are ELs that have been identified in lower elementary grades, maybe second grade, maybe third grade, and they are in high school and they are still in the program. So there has to be a revision of the rigor of our ESL or ELD instruction, as well as how are we empowering teachers in content areas to be able to also help these students not only develop English language proficiency, but learn that content that they are teaching. So if we look at our programs and we see that the rigor is not at level, or we need more training for our teachers, we need to start looking at those avenues, because our program needs to prove that in 5 years or less, English learners are able to be reclassified or be able to exit that program. So as a psychologist and as a counselor, you have to know that there's that window of 5 years. And that's important, because that looks at the quality of your program. That really calls for ESL teachers and content teachers to work together and to collaborate to help each other to get these children to where they need to be to exit the program. Career readiness benchmarks are also very important for ESSA. How are we looking and measuring, at the end of grades 5, 8, and 11, how are we looking at our ELs achieving those standards? Chronic absenteeism is also important here. Why is that important? Because if the students are not in school, they cannot learn. And it is important to make all students aware of, what will be the maximum that you could be out of school, especially when you are at the high school level. Why? Because we know that there are certain indicators for students who do not graduate. And usually students who have chronic absenteeism are the ones that will drop out of school. Okay, so there is a connection. Now, why do we need to actually talk to ELs about this? Why do we need to reach out and talk and discuss with parents of ELs about this? Because culturally speaking, not every school system in the world has the same kinds of parameters that we have. So if you are in a school where you have many parents who are culturally and linguistically diverse, and you have many ELs who are new to the country, you need to have somewhere along those lines somebody explaining how do we look at attendance, in our schools. Why is it important that culturally and linguistically diverse parents do not keep their children at home because it is too cold to go to school, or because it is raining too much, or because there are other issues? How can we help them, move from the area of this is what I used to do in my country to this is what is required in this country? So we have to be aware that many of these issues regarding the Future Ready Pennsylvania Index and the indicators need to be on our radar screen to explain not only to parents but also to students what are our areas where we as counselors and as psychologists can support these students and families to understand what is required from them. In many instances, many of the referrals for evaluations from psychologists, it's because there is a lack of understanding of what parents really need to know in relation to the culture of our schools. We have to be very targeted, especially counselors. When you meet with parents, explain certain things that maybe, they are very, very unfamiliar with. Attendance is one issue that, goes across the board. It's not just children or high school students that have that problem. If we take a look at attendance in kindergarten, you're going to notice that we also have a problem in kindergarten. So how can we empower parents to understand the importance of having children in school and create a culture of really, meeting the guidance of the culture of our schools' regulations? Going to regulations now, one piece that is also very important for you to understand is that English language development programs, as well as the language instruction educational programs, are required by our Chapter 4. So it is important that we all understand that every LEA in Pennsylvania, if they have English learners, they must offer these programs. It is not a matter of if I have, X number of students, then I will offer the program. No. All LEAs are required by law, by Chapter 4, to provide a program for each student whose dominant language is not English. Okay, so that is something that we all need to understand. You don't know how many phone calls sometimes I got here at Patton when, I will have parent advocates or sometimes even teachers that will ask me if they have to have a program because they only have one student that is an EL, or if there's other way that they can actually not offer the program. And the answer is no, by law, you have to have a program. There's also issues related not just to the instructional program, but there's issues with Civil Rights Act of 1964. All children have the right to have access to education. And that is also important that we go back and take a look at the Office for Civil Rights and how in the past 5 years we have seen that there is a lot of communication between the Office for Civil Rights and the Department of Education that deals with the Office of English Language Acquisition. So they are really teaming up now to make statements such as the ones that they have in this Dear Colleague letter, in which they not only tell us that this is, part of the law, but also the obligations that we have to report if things are not going, the way of the law. So even as I can tell you that there have been advocates who have been really looking into districts that are not looking at offering a program for ELs. Now there are more advocates because in the past, we always rely on the idea, in many districts that most EL parents they have no background knowledge on the laws that are in the United States in relation to the education of their children. But lately, we have had some phone calls of advocates of parents who bring ELs to this country. They are adopting children who come here at school age, and their parents know the laws of the United States. They know what is required to service their children, and those are the movers and shakers. And, saying that we need to improve how we deal with English language learners. So yes, there is the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that addresses what we need to do. When we talk about that, we also need to talk about equal participation and meaningful access. And in many instances, when we talk about English learners and their programs, there are gaps in how ELD programs are articulated throughout our state. You could find programs that go all the way from providing daily ESL instruction or ELD instruction to programs that do not provide daily ELD instruction, and therefore in those places you will see that there are many referrals for ELs to be evaluated for special ed. So the question here is that if your program is not being implemented as required by the law and by PDE, daily ELD instruction, and you only have an ESL teacher going there for 20 minutes 3 times a week, you are not meeting the equal participation and meaningful access measure that we have. And why is that important for a psychologist? Because children who are not giving that equal participation and meaningful access and are referred for special education, you actually have right there something to look at, which is lack of opportunity to learn. And when children have lack of opportunity to learn, then it is not really a disability. You have to measure that from that perspective. Are these children really provided a program that is assisting them in the process of acquiring English and learning content? That's why we want to really have that discussions with you, because in many instances, you are the one that has to really see whether in reality you are looking at a candidate for receiving special education, or maybe not. So that's why we are giving you the information or the right tools for you to take a look. And definitely, you all know about Section 504, that you can also err on the other side. And that is that sometimes you hear people in districts talking about the idea that, oh, no, you cannot evaluate this kid because he's an EL. And because he's an EL, you have to wait 3 or 4 years until he learns the language. And no, there's not such a thing. There's not a law or a statement that actually calls for delaying evaluation, when in reality there is, the suspicion of a disability. But that's where, Francine said that we need to know how to look for is it a language barrier or is it a disability? If the child really shows that there is a disability, then he is entitled to have, that taken care of through special education services. The other part is that the Office for Civil Rights, we quote this, that we have to be very careful that what we are looking at is at a disability and looking at evidence for that, and not just because he's limited English proficient or the student does not have enough English proficiency to perform at grade level, then we are saying, okay, then it is a disability, right? So there has to be some ways to collect evidence so we make the most, appropriate and exact decision with a team about how to deal with that. I remember that there was a very good psychologist that said, you know, the best way to do this is actually to shadow a student. When somebody refers an EL for evaluation, if I want to know how is this a real case where I am looking at a student with a disability, or is it lack of opportunity to learn? So when you shadow the student and you go from class to class, from ESL to maybe the content areas, and you see what is happening with that child during instruction, you will realize in many instances that it's not a disability. It's simply that the gap has been created because there's not enough supports for that student to meet the requirements of course development in math or reading, and the ESL instruction is not supporting that English language development with rigor. So I think that that's important for all of us to make sure that these students are moving ahead because we have good programs, that they are not falling through the gaps because their programs are not working, and then we're penalizing them for that. Okay, so in order to do that, we have technical assistance. We can, it's either provided by PDE, ESL, Bilingual Education Program Advisors, that you can contact them. If you go to that PDE website that we showed you before, you have everything there to be able to communicate with them and ask them questions regarding program policy. Okay, so we have also the Bureau of Special Ed, and we also have our ESL points of contact at all of our IUs. There are points of contact. And here at our 3 patent sites that, we can take a look at multi-tier systems of support. There are guidelines for English learners with IEPs. There is a document that we have that gives you a little bit of more information. There's also a document called Frequently Asked Questions, and ELs with Individualized Education. So there are some tools that we have, some information. And also, if you can always contact us, or you can contact Amy, or you can contact other of our, school psychologists that we have on site, as well as any of us, that we can provide you with maybe some of the answers that you're looking for. These are important questions. This section is really part of what you will find in our patent document that we put together and completed and revised February 2018. They are called Frequently Asked Questions, English Learners with Individualized Education Programs, and you can find them in our patent website. The information is at the bottom of your screen. Questions are important, because sometimes if you ask the right question, you actually get people to think about it, and maybe they decide that this is not what I really want to proceed with this child. So number one question, is the ELD ESL instruction sufficient in quantity and quality? That's why you need to sort of shadow the student. That's why you need to get evidence that the program is aligned to what PDE says it should be aligned. Okay, is the LIEP effective and aligned to the proficiency levels of the student and the PA English Language Development Standards? Our next webinar, we're going to go deeper into program. How does a program really look like? And we do have Pennsylvania English Language Development Standards. We do have descriptors for proficiency levels that you need to have. We are going to provide that for you, so you understand when I say, oh, he's a level 1. What does that mean? What can he do in English? What are some things that we need to look at? Is plan instruction curriculum in the content areas delivered according to English language proficiency levels of the student and the PA English Language Development Standards, and appropriate linguistic related scaffolds, supports, and interventions provided by content teachers? In short words, what you're asking here is if there is a curriculum for ESL instruction, if there is a curriculum for reading and math instruction that has some look for or has some interventions that would be, crafted according to the levels of these children. Because if I am teaching children who are ELs at the lowest levels of proficiency, as if they were native speakers, we are actually not addressing their needs. And therefore, that content will not be learned, at master level or even, at benchmark level. Do content teachers have the resources, skills, and knowledge to address the needs of ELs in their classrooms? Do you know if those content teachers who are referring you ELs for evaluation have ever been trained in how to deal with English learners in their classrooms? Because if they have no idea in what to do with them, then their only lens that they have is the deficiency model. Oh, they cannot do the work in second grade. They cannot do the work in fifth grade. So that's why they are referring the student you. Are content teachers trained in specific methodologies to provide ELs with meaningful access to the content? That's almost like, the question prior. The question has to be also, have you ever been trained in how to teach English learners in your classroom? Do you implement the ELD standards? So those are some of the crucial questions when you get referrals. Is collaboration between the ESL and content teachers formally scheduled? That is crucial. In many school districts that have a high number of ELs in special education, guess what? All of those three, questions that we have on the screen, they do not happen there. Teachers do not have no idea in what to do with ELs when they are in their classrooms. There's no collaboration of what the ESL teacher does in their classroom when they pull them out and they bring them back, and there is no conversation about the students. So when you see that this is happening, chances are that there is not a disability. What you see there is a language barrier that hasn't been addressed properly. So that's, a total different conversation then. Professional development is key for not only ESL teachers, but also has to be part in the radar of administrators. When I walk into a school and the principal it does not give me information that pertains actually to the administrator when they have English learners. And I ask about, how are you using Access for ELs results to support the teaching and learning of your ELs in your school? And he says, well, about ESL, or she says, about ESL, I only have my ESL teacher. She knows everything. She's the one that has to give you all of that. Well, actually, no, it's the administrator that has to know how he's using data or she's using data to help the other professionals, the other educators in the building, support all students, including English learners. So those are the areas where if you do not see something like, a collaborative way, adequate services being provided to these children, then you also need to look not only at evaluating them from the perspective of a disability, but also how is this happening that this child is not learning. Maybe it's the system, maybe it's not the child, okay? So the other part that is also very important, which has been an issue sometimes when there's a referral of an EL for special education, is the homeschool communication. The fact that parents do not speak English needs to be bridged and taken care of by the school system. That's the law. It is a requirement. So sometimes I have heard teachers saying, for even parent-teacher conference, these parents need to bring their own translator. No, they don't have to. The school system has to provide it. That's being culturally responsive. And how do I communicate to these parents what I am doing in school with your child is important. We have to understand that even if the parents cannot communicate in English, that doesn't mean that they don't care for their children. They would like their children to be successful. So whenever there is an issue or a referral for special education, I have seen psychologists to take some steps before jumping into setting up a set of assessments, but just saying, can we talk to the parents? Have you contacted parents and see whether this kind of behavior is also happening at home? Because if you have a disability, the disability cannot be just in one language, right? It has to be a disability that is happening there, in the environment. So we have to really be able to communicate with parents and being able to explain certain things to parents in the language that they feel more comfortable. Okay, in conclusion, we really have to look at culturally responsive educational practices. And the only way that we are going to get to that area of feeling that we are looking at our students with all of these lenses that are required is when we see that these procedures happen throughout the school system, that all of us need to be able to articulate what are these policies that we have at the state level, at the federal level, about our students. We always, when we started with the very first slides with Francine, you saw a graphic where it says that an educational system has three main elements or components. One is the policies that govern the system, people who follow these policies and know about them, and the procedures that affect also how do we work together in an environment of culturally responsiveness and equality. That's the bottom line here. If we as educators, as psychologists, counselors, principals, do not even know the policies that exist, that govern, that, that group of students, we're actually not being culturally responsive. We have to be able to articulate that there are these policies, that I need to know what the policies say, so my procedures in the school are aligned to that system of equity and of culturally responsiveness. So in order for us to do that, we, as a team, decided that it would be very important for you to get familiar with those policies. The next webinars, the next parts or the next two parts are going to really dwell more into the procedures, or the procedures attached to the policies, and also the culturally responsiveness. So the whole idea here is that all students should be afforded equitable and meaningful access to education. And it is really us who have the obligation to be familiar and to also look at the way that we are doing things in school. Are they aligned to these policies? So that's the important part of this webinar. We have to understand our own educational system from those three components. Once we understand that, then our practices will really improve and we will do a better job with all of our students. I was very happy to see that the National Association of School Psychologists have been very good lately, right? The past 5, 10 years, giving us guidance and giving psychologists guidance regarding the importance of looking at practices with that lens of culturally responsiveness. And we pull this from the best practices in the provision of school psychology services when working with English learners. So we looked at it from the perspective of what does policy say and how aligned they are in their, information, in their statements to school psychologists. Definitely, delivering the language that best meets the students' needs, that's important. Effective and comprehensive supports and services to help these students succeed in all domains, academically, social, behaviorally, and emotionally. I really think that we are very much, aligned to those requirements. And we believe that in all of the next two webinars, we will continue to bring the alignment with NASP. Is that okay that I say NASP? Okay, so good. At the beginning of our presentation, we said that the only way we can award your Act 48 credits is if you go to the link that you have there. Please write it down because it is not in your PowerPoint. So we will keep this on the screen for the last 5 minutes. You have to enter that link and then type the code to open up the survey. The code is LIEP. Okay, and the survey is available through October 3rd. Oh, that's my birthday. Until 4 p.m. Okay, so don't forget, it's open now if you would like to actually, do it now. But write it down, write the code, the link, and then just go in there and answer the questions. If you have any more questions regarding the content of this webinar, or you would like some clarifications, you can always email, and I will give you the next screen that is in your PowerPoint, and that is, let me see if I can go to the next screen. Oh, these are the resources. I'm sorry. I will still give you some time, a couple of minutes, so you can write down the link. Okay. We have the resources page is very rich. We have really tried to give you the most that we could to link with or find some literature that address this, the issue of English learners. We have 3 pages, I think, of resources, and we are always checking the most recent research, so you can actually take a look at the most recent. We keep on looking for tools and ways to support our field. We also have some PDE resources that we addressed throughout the webinar. The Bureau of Special Education has some guidelines for English learners, and with IEPs, they have that on their first, their main page. The Office of English Language Acquisitions, the English Learner Toolkit is fabulous. If you visit there, there's a whole chapter that addresses English learners in special education. We have our English Language Learners Initiative here at Patton, so we also have some resources there and some tools. More Patton resources, English Learners webpage, ELs and Special Education webpage. So you're welcome to go in there and find a lot of good information. WIDA resources. Get familiar with WIDA. Go to their webpage. Just, peruse through all of the assessments and the assessment guides. I know that psychologists love to look at scores and love to look at scale scores and how they can figure this one out. This is a good place to go. There's, tons of good things there. And if you have any questions, you can always email Dr. Victor Rodriguez Diaz at the Patton address. He will be, he will transfer the email, to us, and we will be very glad to answer any of your questions. Thank you very much. You have been a great audience. So the next webinar, next Thursday, the 4th, October October 4th at 2 o'clock. I think there was somebody that was asking that. Yes. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Amy, for coming here and supporting us. She's been very instrumental of going over our PowerPoints and addressing, and aligning that to the field of school counselors. Well, thank you very much, and have a wonderful weekend.